that one of the biggest stumbling points a lot of people have is this vengeful God of the Old Testament, and the idea that in our world today, God chooses. Everybody invokes God and saying, we're in the right. It's a holy war. It's a crusade. It's whatever it is, and we're doing it because God is behind us. So, what you've done here, I think, is to open that up and allow us to look at it from a different point of view. Can we see a sorrowing God? Can we see a God who charges us to act differently?
My teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, likes to say that, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in him either. And he talks about the need to move beyond triumphalism in this era, the need to understand. He talks about how all religions are organs in the body of humanity. And you need the heart to be the heart, and you need the liver to be the liver. Judaism needs to be what it is. Anglicanism needs to be what it is. But if the heart and the liver were to stop speaking, the body would be in trouble. And that in the body of humanity, we need communication between our different traditions. We need, sustenance needs to flow in all directions. And I find that a very powerful way to think about how we relate to each other.
There's nothing like bringing a Jewish friend or a Muslim friend to your own service to make your head just spin with what is she thinking of this? And we kind of pulled out the stops this morning with the baptisms and everything. But I think when I was younger, I used to get more upset about that, and now I think having friends of other faiths has made me realize that we can just find our commonality and celebrate our commonality and talk about the differences in a loving and curious and interested way. And over time, you actually this is the best thing you can do to build understanding and just let each other be who we are. And I love that metaphor of the organs of the body.
I do too.
That's great. So now we come to Leviticus. And maybe you'll say something about the book of Leviticus before we have you read this poem that's a kind of an understatement.
So the book of Leviticus, it's at the heart of the Torah. You think of the Torah as the Torah, the 5 books of Moses have a chiastic structure, which means that there's the Leviticus is in the middle, and then there's sort of concentric circles working their way out. And in the most traditional world, Leviticus is what children first begin to learn when they first start studying Torah. They don't get to start with Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac. They start with the laws of sacrifices and kidneys and entrails and sexual sins, which I have to say I find very challenging. When I entered into the discipline of writing a Torah poem each week, which I did for a few years and shared them on Velveteen Rabbi, and then the best of them were culled into this collection, one for each portion. Writing a Torah poem each week about Genesis is actually pretty easy. Genesis is our family history. We have rivalries, we have siblings, we have fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, and I can relate to that. I have all of those things one way or another. Leviticus is very challenging for me, and I think for a lot of us. You read these endless descriptions of sacrifices and of the blueprints for the tabernacle and the building of the tabernacle, and it's and the way that sacrifices were to be offered, and it can be very hard to relate to. You read this and you think, what does this have to do with my life? But I had committed to engaging with it every week, whether it seemed to speak to me or not. And that was actually wonderful, because I had to find something in it. I couldn't let myself off the hook and say, you know what, this week isn't a good one, so I'm going to skip it. And the poem that we chose for the book of Leviticus actually comes out of one of the portions I have wrestled with the most. This is a portion of the book of Leviticus which begins by talking about how when a woman gives birth, she enters into a state of ritual impurity called tum'ah. And it talks about how if a woman gives birth to a son, she is tameh for 1 month. She can't go into the temple precincts. She gives birth to a daughter, she's tameh for twice as long. And it is easy to read verses like that and prohibitions like that as being fundamentally anti-woman, and there's a fear of women and blood and birth, and God, wow, this is the patriarchy at its worst. But I think there are other ways of understanding it, and incidentally, Jewish tradition backs me up on this. There are certainly interpretations of it which are troubling for me as a modern woman, but there are also interpretations which take it in a new direction. And I hope that this poem does. And yes, this is also a Mother's Day poem. This is called Like God, Tazria. When a woman carries a grain of rice invisible inside her rounded belly, when she has to pee every half hour though her bladder isn't yet under pressure, when her breasts grow tender to the touch and exhaustion wipes her across the floor, when baggy shirts become insufficient and strangers start darting glances, when people want to rub her belly as though she were a good luck Buddha, when her back aches, when what's inside shifts, kicks her in the ribs, does somersaults, when she goes on long walks, eats spicy food, has vigorous sex at 39 weeks, anything to move them through the narrow place into whatever liberation is coming. When a woman gives birth to an infant, even the air around her crackles. Euphoria and overwhelm and tears settle in for a month, maybe 2, of blood and bodily fluids, tiny fingernails and eyelashes, everything she thought she knew changed by the enormity of being like God and shaping new life inside her compassionate womb. I was pregnant when I wrote that.
You're around home crackers.
And that came from more than just being pregnant, because you'd also had a miscarriage.
I had. I became pregnant for the first time in very January of 2009. And as soon as I found out about it, rejoiced. I mean, it was, rejoiced, overwhelmed, all of those things. And I held that joyful anticipation for less than a week before I lost the pregnancy, and was devastated in a way I had never imagined. I can't explain rationally why I was so devastated to lose something that had only been true for, as far as I knew, for a few days. But it really wrecked me for a while. And my process of healing from that was a process, my spiritual director counseled me to write poems. So that was what I did. And when I hit the 3-month mark, when a trimester had passed, I released the poems online. And they're on my website, they're on Velveteen Rabbi as a free download for anyone who needs them. So I mentioned on Mother's Day, if you know anyone who has suffered miscarriage or who's grieving in that way, or to whom you think those poems might offer healing, that's what they're there for, and take them out into the world and share them. But then I became pregnant again soon thereafter, and now I have a 17-month-old. So I'm very grateful.
And a year's worth of mother poems.
And a year's worth of mother poems.
So that may be the next book, I hope.
I hope so too. Right here.
So then we get to Numbers. You want to say something about the book of Numbers?
Book of Numbers, the Hebrew name for the book of Numbers is Bamidbar, which means in the desert. Interesting, the root from Midbar, for Bamidbar, is the same root as ledaber, to speak. So the Midbar is where Davar, where word comes through. The desert is where we go to hear what's coming. And of course, I think this is a trope that's present in Christian tradition too. Jesus goes into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, yeah? Which I think is a kind of recasting of Moses going up Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. But the desert is where these encounters happen. And in the book of Numbers, there's also a lot of talk about preparing to move into the land that God will show them, the promised land, and the military challenges that await them there. And that's what this poem comes out of. This poem was written while I was living in Jerusalem a few summers ago. It's called Downside. It comes out of Parashat Maseh and begins with a short quote from the book of Numbers. But if you do not dispossess the inhabitants of the land, those whom you allow to remain shall be stings in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land in which you live. Here's the part God apparently didn't say, at least not aloud where anyone could hear. Dispossessing anyone, not as easy as it sounds, and tends to have side effects, feelings of guilt among the tender-hearted, and a certain hardening of those who do battle. Refugee camps persisting for generations, breeding bitter fury which tends to explode. And don't forget the damage done to your Chelek Elohim, the eternal spark in you, which dims with each interrogation, each humiliation.